Good afternoon. My name is Melissa Gutierrez. I'm with California Relief, the Education and Communications Program Manager here. I'm just your host here today. The real show is with Leo Buck and Michael Flynn of Common Vision. You're here for our Building Solidarity and Racial Justice webinar, which we are really proud to host this 2-hour training. We're really glad you're here. Thanks for showing up today. This is a very cool, very critical, important topic, especially for all of us working to be a better neighbor in our communities and do some big projects together. We are in for a treat today. Happy to have you here. Housekeeping items really quick. Make sure you're on mute. I think you are. If you're not, I'll take care of that. If you have any comments or questions, just type them into the questions box down there on the chat. It should show up on your IM screen, and I'll be fielding those if necessary during the conversation, and then towards the end we'll be doing a full FAQ. We have some polls to get started too, but first I'm going to turn it over to Leo, who is going to be your host for the next 2 hours. So Leo, take it away.
Outstanding. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We're thrilled to be able to present this webinar with you all. It's a huge moment for the urban forestry movement in terms of working in communities of color and building meaningful partnerships across those lines. So the time is absolutely perfect for this training. Melissa, I believe, is there a statement from Cindy as well as to why Relief sees this training as important and necessary?
There is. Cindy Blaine, our ED, is actually in a plane as we speak, so she's not going to make it, but here's a quick hello from her recorded for you.
Cindy Blaine, Executive Director of California Relief. Thank you very much for joining us today for this important discussion. I'm very pleased to introduce our webinar on building solidarity for racial justice, presented by Leo Buck and Michael Flynn of Common Vision. Common Vision is a Relief Network member organization which plants fruit tree orchards at schools and communities throughout the state. They've been working with communities of color for almost 10 years and have long incorporated training for their staff on issues of racism, racial justice, and social justice. This webinar about racial justice is part of our California Relief series of cultural competency trainings. We started this educational focus at our leadership workshop in August at Riverside. The training today is a deeper exploration of the important and sometimes uncomfortable issues surrounding racism in our communities. I believe it's absolutely necessary for our network members to better understand how systemic racism works in order to build strong, long-lasting partnerships with communities of color. We need to do this work so that all of our California communities enjoy the benefits of the urban forest and healthier communities. Again, I'm really glad you've joined us today for this workshop. I know we'll all learn a lot today, and I hope you'll speak up and share your experiences, feedback, and questions after the presentation, or even during the presentation via the texting mechanism. Now I'd like to introduce California Relief Board Member Jose Gonzalez, founder and CEO of Latino Outdoors. Jose has provided cultural competency training to our Relief staff and presented at our Riverside workshop. To stress the importance and value of this work, he will share his thoughts on the role of equity in this work as it relates to the urban forests and the intersection with environmental, racial, and social justice. Thank you.
Great. Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Yes, I'm here. Thank you, everybody. I just have a few quick statements so that the webinar can just start with Common Vision. I'm really excited about this. I just want to stress again that as a new board member for California Relief, part of the reason and the excitement in being able to join and work with California Relief is taking this work on, and that really looking how changes in the system so that there isn't separation in how people think about doing this work and this movement, as if something's just fits within a frame of environmental justice, for example, and that somehow that's separate from all environmental work, and how it's connected with all community building work. And we're really trying to stress that idea of intersection, because regardless of who we're working with, what we're doing, we're looking at this as, the social ecology just as much as the natural ecology. So I'm really excited to do this, and my parting word is to make sure for everybody to understand that this is a process. This does not end with or start with this webinar, and I'm looking forward to hearing from all of the network and working with all of the network members to make sure that we're doing this work, because ultimately this is the kind of work that's needed to be able to really deliver on the full mission and work that I see California Relief being able to do with all communities in California. Thank you.
So when we look at the goals of this training, and thank you, Jose, for those words. It's great to have you on board as a Relief Board member and on the call today. When we look at the goals for this training, we're looking at three primary goals. We want to prepare Relief Network members to work as allies in communities of color, and ally is a term that's going to come up a lot today. We want to foster an actively anti-racist organizational culture within the Relief Network. And we chose those words very specifically, actively anti-racist. We're going to talk a lot about different levels of racism today, from individual, social, systemic, and institutional. Because of that pervasiveness, the large scale of racism in the country, and we're going to talk a lot about that, we're looking to foster an organizational culture that works actively against that works to deconstruct racism throughout society and as it pertains to urban forestry and the environmental movement. And then we're looking to lay the groundwork for an urban forestry coalition that is more reflective of California's population. And one of the things that became quite apparent at the Riverside conference to us, the leadership workshop, was that the urban forestry community, at least so far as showed up to that workshop, is not reflective of the state's population. And, that's long been an obstacle in the environmental world. The environmental movement has long been a largely segregated movement, and one of the goals for this training is to get some of the white folks in the environmental movement a little bit better prepared and a whole lot better, really, at engaging with communities of color, both in staff, volunteer, and stakeholder contexts.
Fantastic. My name is Michael Flynn. I'm Executive Co-Director of Common Vision. Before we hop into the topics that we're going to cover today, I wanted to put a little survey out in the webinar to get a sense of who we have in the proverbial room. All right. Yeah, if you could take a moment to fill out these 4 questions right now, that'll help us get to know who's here.
And Melissa, I believe that you have to end the poll in order for us to see results.
Thanks. Okay. Excellent. There you go. Are you guys seeing the results there? Or is that just me?
I am not seeing them.
Okay, well, I'll report them then. We have 67% of the people in this room are in management or leading groups of people roles. 44% are in admin or behind the scenes, and 33% are workers or on the grounds people.
So we have a lot of people who wear multiple hats.
Yeah, looks like it. Great. Ready for the next one?
Yeah.
This one is, as what race do people identify you? We'll leave this up for 20 seconds.
And you'll notice here that it's phrased as, what race do people identify you? This is not about how you identify. We like to talk about identity when it comes to race as assigned identity versus chosen identity. We'll talk about that a little more. But we're looking for, when you walk down the street, how do people identify you?
Great.
Oh, and the other piece was we only had 5 options, so if other is your response, uh, we weren't allowed to put the 6th one. So we'll extrapolate.
I'm going to head and close that one. We have 89% people identify them as white and 11% people identify them as Latino. So that's telling for our audience. Got one more here. Have you participated in diversity or anti-racism trainings in the past? And if so, what was your experience? Please let us know in the next 20 seconds. All right, we've got 100%. I'll close this. 22% say that it felt important, but I was left unsure of what to do next. 67% said that they did gain important perspective and tools they do use in their work and life. And 11% say that no, they had not taken a type of training like this before. So that's an exciting mix. Back to you, Leo and Michael.
Fantastic. Thanks for doing that. Great. We have some ground to cover today. Here's a little table of contents, if you will, for the rest of the training. Our first piece and perhaps most important piece is going over some basic anti-racism vocabulary. What we've found in our little more than a decade of doing this work, and I think a lot of it actually was from our many years of not finding good trainings around this work, is that a lot of the discussions around race and trainings around race halt because we're not talking about the same things. So the vocabulary is going to be what are we even talking about here, so that when we use words like racism, we're talking about the same thing, and that goes a long way to building bridges and skills and capacity around cross-cultural work. We're going to look at racism in individual, social, institutional, and systemic contexts, so the whole spread of how it shows up in society. Looking at white privilege and how it operates. We're doing a little differentiation between intent and impact, which has some juicy implications for how we interact in the world. A little section we call common stumbling blocks. This is from a decade of doing these trainings with white folks, and this is a distilled group of 9 places that we've seen the discussion derail or get hung up in defensive, and we're excited to share them because we found them to be really good learning tools around anti-racism work. And the last piece is some concrete steps towards creating anti-racist organizational culture. So I want to leave you with some skills, or at least a map of where we go from here. Often with these trainings, we're in the same room as those that we're training. So this webinar-based experience is definitely a somewhat of a challenge to the full experience. But regardless of webinar or in person, there's some guidelines that help create an effective and safe training. When we talk about safety as one of our guidelines, we do it for 2 reasons. One, it's really important that no one in this webinar feels or is directly attacked. That there is a kind of a sense and a realness of safety. The other reason we bring up safety is to differentiate between safety and comfort. The topic of racism is uncomfortable. It's a horrible legacy that is alive and active today. Really thinking deeply about it is almost guaranteed to create uncomfortability, and that is something that is essential to learning in this process. So this differentiation between creating a safe space here, but creating a kind of intentionally uncomfortable space simultaneously is really the the sweet spot for understanding here. Looking at the next two, confidentiality and amnesty, these are kind of two sides of the same piece, which is to say what is said and shared in this webinar amongst this little web-based community here. This is Leo and I are kind of exempt from these. These you can go ahead and spread our spread what we say and talk about that all you want. But if somebody in this room has a question or comment, this is a safe space where they will not be spoke about in the third person, kind of off in some other place. That what kind of in that regard, what happens in this room stays in this room. Kind of in the bigger picture, what happens in this room we hope is spread far and wide and deeply impacts how you live and work in the urban forestry movement. Amnesty being
and throughout the webinar. Oh, sorry, Michael, but throughout the webinar, we do want to encourage you to use the questions function of GoToWebinar. It's right there in the sidebar, and if you have questions that come up, please ask them.
Yeah, we find that in these trainings, about 25% of the questions come from people raising hands and asking, and about 75% comes from, wow, there's a person over there that's not breathing. Let's go into that. We can't tell that part, so we only have this 25% information, so please help us out and hop in the questions field. It will make for a more juicy discussion and help for really understanding for everybody. So amnesty, you're not going to be kind of held, convicted, from some piece of vulnerability that you share here. In fact, the confidentiality and amnesty pieces of the guidelines serve to say this needs to be a vulnerable space, a place where people are willing to go to the edge of their comfort, because that's where the growth and the learning takes place. And so we need to have that that safe space for it. Last piece is arrive ready to examine. Defensiveness is kind of a natural and typical response when we hit our edge around thinking about and talking about and understanding racism. It is typical to the point of what always happens. And I would even argue that that getting to a place where there's a rub, where you are experiencing defensiveness, is generally a really good sign that you're about to learn something. And so readiness to examine, readiness to go to the edge of defensiveness, and then willingness to move through it is going to create the best learning environment.
So we want to take a moment to talk about a few other isms. Today's training, again, is focused on anti-racism work and understanding systemic racism to build solidarity for racial justice. But we want to acknowledge sexism, classism, ableism, all these isms that function throughout society, right, and serve as oppressive forces to people throughout society. Those are not what we're talking about today. We're specifically focusing on racial justice for a very specific reason, which is that it's of unique concern to the urban forestry community right now. With the recent designation of Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund grant money specifically to disadvantaged communities throughout California, I believe everyone here is familiar with that, but in case you're not, all of the funding for urban forestry coming from the state right now is designated for what Cal EPA identifies as disadvantaged communities. These are communities that are economically and environmentally at a particular disadvantage. And we'll talk more about the reasoning for this, but when you overlay that with a demography map, those areas are primarily populated by people of color. So the vast majority of urban forestry work going forward right now is slated to be done in communities of color. Now, the urban forestry community, as far as the doers, the nonprofits involved go, is a very, very white space, right? It is primarily white-led and white-staffed organizations. So there's this unique way that is different from the sexism piece, for example, where primarily white organizations are going to be showing up to do social benefit work largely in communities of color. And that creates a really unique opportunity to build this sort of racial justice solidarity. So that's why we're focusing on anti-racism work specifically today.
So there are different ways that that we tend to make sense of the world and people. Kind of on the one hand, there's this universal. There's this way in which all people are the same. You know, we have the same needs for water, for air, for food. You know, we're all born from a woman, and death rate is still 100%. You know, we share a universality. You know, this is often the goal of cultural and religious celebrations. This sense of oneness. This is a very legitimate and important way to connect some of the common threads and experiences that bind us all. An individual way of looking at the world kind of honors and focuses on ways that we're all unique, and each snowflake unlike any other. You know, that our thoughts, our dreams are our own, and you know, never before seen in the history of the human world. This kind of confluence of all the pieces that we are. You know, then this way of looking at the world is really important, you know, to kind of ignite and honor kind of the creative offering that each person has in and of themselves. Both of these are not the way that we're going to be looking at the world during this webinar. We're going to be focusing on this space in between, this place of culture, this place in which we are like some people and unlike others, that our experiences are shared with certain groups and differ sometimes greatly from other groups. So that's where we're going to be hanging out today. Our society generally is kind of happy to focus in either the universal or individual, and gets a little more shaky and uncomfortable in this space between. And that's where we're going to be looking.
So what's at stake in this work? The answer to that is massive, right? We have two different ways of looking at it. There's what's at stake in the negative and what's at stake in the positive. And in the negative, as these largely white groups start to work in communities of color, there's myriad opportunities for ruining, exploding what could be perfectly wonderful partnerships that are extraordinarily productive to creating a thriving urban forest. So one of the reasons why we're focusing so heavily on building capacity around understanding systemic racism is that it's really a necessary building block. That type of solidarity is a necessary building block in meaningful partnerships between primarily white organizations and communities of color. To have solidarity around issues of racial justice and basic understanding of the impacts of systemic racism on the lives of people in these communities is absolutely critical. And the opportunity that could be lost by a slight misuse of power or a lack of understanding as to why race matters in these contexts, the opportunities that could be lost are immense. On the flip side of that, the partnerships that stand to be built with this massive wave of funding for the UF community to work in communities of color is tremendous. There is such a huge opportunity to build a broader environmental coalition, a broader urban forestry coalition that truly is representative of the population of the state, and the power that lies in that for us to make massive leaps forward in the state of California with regards to urban forestry is immense. So what's at stake in this training is our ability to build that broader coalition and to create that thriving urban forest throughout the state's diverse communities.
I think one thing I would add on the what's at stake. I mean, we're speaking a lot of current demographics for most of the organizations within Relief and vis-a-vis the communities that are served, especially in the DACs. But I think what's at stake kind of in the long haul, and hopefully the very short to realize long game here, is that it will no longer be primarily white organizations doing this work, but is, I think, a kind of necessary and I think what will emerge as an evident side effect of organizations doing this work is a greater attraction and staffing within organizations. So both organizations already led by communities of color kind of gaining strength from this focus, and also organizations finding a much more diverse leadership and volunteer base alike.
And I would add to that that from our own experience, those meaningful partnerships really are at stake with this understanding systemic racism piece. In our early work, as Melissa alluded to, and Cindy as well in her recorded comments, Common Vision's been working in low-income schools, which categorically almost in the state of California means in communities of color, for the last 11 years. And early in that work, we really lacked this understanding on how systemic racism affected the communities. And in doing those sort of cross-cultural partnerships with local organizations, we really messed up a couple of times. We really misunderstood the way that power moved with us just due to the color of our skin and the allocation of resources. And nearly ruined what have turned out to be some of our most prolific partnerships. I'm thinking of a couple of organizations, primarily in LA, who set us on the path of doing this anti-racism work by calling us out on some misuse of power, and have blossomed into some of the most productive relationships in our organization. We, in partnership with that organization, maintain 2 orchards in schools in South Central Los Angeles with upwards of 100 fruit trees producing immense amounts of fruit. So the potential there for those really meaningful partnerships that are immensely impactful on the local community is tremendous.
So I think we're going to have another survey. I think a single question survey pop on the screen at this juncture in relationship to our first big vocabulary piece, white privilege.
We'll give another 15 seconds to answer this poll. All right, looks like our votes are in. We've got 56 say that they have a sense of white privilege from context, but haven't really explored it. 44% say they have discussed and explored this concept on their own, and 0 for the other categories.
Fantastic. Let's hop right in with some definition work.
Absolutely.
Are you muted, Leo?
No, I'm not. You'll have to forgive the sports metaphor here, but we've never found a better short quote on what privilege is. We have it here as being born on third base and believing you hit a triple. So the idea here, for those that are not baseball inclined, a triple is the hardest hit to get in baseball. So it is starting with a massive advantage in terms of scoring a point. You're 3/4 of the way there. But one of the most insidious ways in which privilege operates is that the haver of that privilege is made blind to its operation by society.
So for some definition work, we turn to Kendall Clark, a professor and theorist who's oft quoted in his definitions around white privilege, race, and power. And we're going to look at 2 different definitions and get a sense of kind of their difference and how they work together. Definition 1, white privilege, a right advantage or immunity granted or enjoyed by white persons beyond the common advantage of all others, an exemption in many particular cases from certain burdens or liabilities. 2, a privileged position, the possession of an advantage white persons enjoy over non-white persons. These two definitions are similar but have a slightly different feel, and kind of understanding the operation of both becomes important. One is looking at ways in which white privilege just generally creates advantage or opportunity, greater access to opportunity and resource for white folks. The second one has a little bit of a power over if something given to white folks that kind of the inverse necessarily means a disadvantageous receipt for the folks of color. So both of these, one is this idea that there are common advantages beyond that of others from having white skin. The other piece, again, something that kind of advantages white folks and disadvantages folks of color.
As we talk about this, this is a place where the training can become quite personal. In my case, being aware of the way white privilege functions in my life has been incredibly powerful over the last decade. When I think about some simple examples that come up,
Muted.
Maybe I'm revealing too much, but I speed when I drive almost with impunity, 5 or 10 miles over the speed limit all of the time, full well knowing that if I get pulled over, most likely I'm going to get a warning, and at worst I'm going to get a speeding ticket. And as we've seen in the news cycle, with the incredible level of violence from law enforcement towards people of color in the last year, that privilege of not being afraid for my physical safety when I interact with the police is experienced seemingly immensely different by communities of color. So there's all these ways, and that's a big example, but there's all these ways. Even the sports metaphor that we used on the slide beforehand, the baseball metaphor, that could arguably be an example of male privilege, which is slightly different, right? We use sports metaphors constantly throughout society, and because power has traditionally sat in one place, in this case with white males, where power has sat in our society for centuries. Those common experiences also serve to privilege me in my communications.
So in understanding white privilege, many universities use this one piece written by Peggy Melntosh called Unpacking the Knapsack. A little backstory on kind of how this piece emerged. Peggy Melntosh is a women's studies professor, a white women's studies professor, and in a staff meeting with other folks in her department was strongly challenged on her blind spots around race as it pertains to power and in the feminist movement, and apparently it got quite heated. Peggy got quite defensive. That night she's doing some deep reflection on what her colleague shared with her, and she decided that in the next day that she was going to put her goggles on, her lenses for seeing white privilege, and trying to get a sense of this kind of invisible privilege that her colleagues were referring to, and write down every single example over the course of a 24-hour period where white privilege, where she could identify white privilege in operation. And so here is from a list of 50 that she pulled off in her first day of thinking about this stuff closely. Here's 5 we pulled from it.
I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time.
I do not have to educate my children to be aware of systemic racism for their own daily physical protection.
I can turn on the television or open the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented.
When I am told about our national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is.
Whether I use checks, credit cards, or cash, I can count on my skin color not to work against the appearance of financial reliability. So these are just a few examples of the way that white privilege functions throughout society. And the idea here is that this is one of the ways that society advantages white people sort of at every conceivable turn, whether it be with regards to financial reliability or representation in history class or education. Communities of color are disadvantaged while white people are advantaged at nearly every turn. And being aware of the ways in which I'm advantaged has been incredibly powerful in terms of being able to work cross-culturally in communities of color. The idea that I'm aware of my privilege and leveraging that privilege whenever possible to the advantage of communities of color, in our experience, has made for much more meaningful partnerships. So we've arrived at an interactive moment in the training, and I know that I'm seeing that the questions field has not been used yet, but we're very much hoping that you'll use it here. We want to turn to you all for some definitions of racism. If you would be so kind as to use the questions field here and enter in your definition, your answer to the question, what is racism? And we'll take about 3 minutes for that so that you have a little bit of time to think. And Melissa, I seem to be unable to see the questions that people are asking. I see a little question mark pop up next to their name, but I'm not able to see the actual questions. Are you able to see them?
Unmuted.
Hey, Leo, I was muted for some reason. Sorry, yes, I am getting questions in. We have a few definitions here. I'll start reading a
Perfect.
few.
So let's give it another minute. I see only we're still waiting on a few, so let's give it another moment and see what comes in.
Great. Yeah, go ahead and test out your question capabilities. We'll get to everything in this question box.
And Melissa, if you can cut and paste those questions, you can throw them in the chat so we can see them as well.
All right, I'll go ahead and do that. I think. So go ahead and check your chat box. I'll start sending over some of your answers.
Great. well, this is great. This actually does end up making them anonymous, which was the
Perfect.
hope.
Perfect. Great. We still have time while we're still taking answers and ideas here.
We'll hang up for another 20 seconds here.
You guys have some good ideas.
All right, feel free to continue. You can just send that in the chat if it comes through in the next little bit. Shall we read a few of these that we have here?
Yeah, go ahead, Leo. Oh, we have another. I'll send that.
All right. Well, we have definitions of racism. An assumption about the character of another person based on their ethnic origins.
We've got being treated differently than others merely because of your race, assuming something about a person merely because of their skin color.
Racism is the belief that some people are better or worse than others due to differences in race. All right, so we do this exercise in every training, doing a racism definition, and what we find is often very much the responses are similar to what we're finding here, where the race prejudice piece gets is nailed. That part is comes out in almost every definition. This is what we were taught in Martin Luther King Day in grade school, that racism is prejudice against people based on the color of their skin. That is an important force and tendency to look at, but it's not the whole of the definition that we're using here. In order for racism to have that ism piece, in order for it to have the kind of ubiquitous power that it has here in the United States and in society, it has to have the power piece. That is to say, there has to be the power to back up those racial prejudices, which have a combined force of creating something that operates not just individually or socially, but through the entire society.
And this is a really, really important distinction. This form of racism that we were taught about in grade school, this idea that racism equals race prejudice, is overly simplistic, but not just that. It doesn't allow for a disambiguation between two things that have immensely different levels of impact on society. When we add this power piece to it, we're looking at the way in which a pervasively racist system impacts the lives of people of color. So when we add this power piece, we're looking at a much, much broader system. A lot of white people have experienced race prejudice, right? We've experienced being treated differently or having assumptions made about us based on the color of our skin. But without the immense power backing of hundreds of years of history, of current government policy, of attitudes that are broad throughout society and parts of society where power resides, it doesn't have the same sort of deterministic power as to what options regarding health, wealth, well-being are available to us in our lives. So in order to disambiguate this race prejudice, this idea that, we make assumptions about people based on the color of their skin, from racism, this much, much larger structure that greatly impacts people's lives. The power piece is really critical in understanding that distinction.
So when looking at racism, we want to take a step back and look at how it operates, kind of from the individual side all the way out to some of its larger kind of society-wide operations. And this is an important piece in kind of evaluating, for me, evaluating my own understanding of racism. I personally was taught in school and focused on the individual and social levels of racism. When we're talking about the individual level, we're talking about kind of individual acts of racism, ranging, from hate crimes and acts of meanness to kind of thoughts or actions that are kind of wielded even within our, our own heads and experience. Ways in which, just as one person living in society, pieces of racism and racist patterns, how that shows up. We kind of expand to the social. This is, in group dynamics, how racism shows up. One kind of common, all too common way that this shows up is that in a group of folks that are of mixed race, that the voices of white folks have a tendency to be the ones that are heard most, that are taken as reliable, as factual, in disproportionately to folks of color. That socially, racism can show up as a silencing or a not hearing, particularly as it pertains to like a difference of understanding or experience.
So the next level of racism that we're going to be talking about quite a bit is institutional racism. And backing up for a second, in this definitions exercise that we did, I ran this exercise in a training about 3 years ago, and again a year later, in a mixed race group, in a truly diverse group of people. And one of the fascinating things that emerged from that is that white people almost exclusively identified this individual level of racism and this idea that racism equals race prejudice in their definitions. Conversely, people of color, when doing this exercise in those trainings, almost entirely identified systemic oppression. One of the definitions that came in that we didn't read is systemic dominance, giving one group privilege and marginalizing another, right? And for people of color doing this exercise in that training, that was ubiquitously the definition that came up, was this institutional level, systemic level, oppressive force. And I want to speak to that in two different ways. One, generally, when we look at issues of racism, one of the ways in which it functions is, making white Americans blind to it, right? It's one of the most perverted ways in which it functions, is that it makes white Americans blind to it. We're trained throughout our upbringing that we live in a meritocracy, for example, that your hard work, if you work hard, you can achieve anything, right? We're led to believe in all these cultural ways that anything we attain based on our own merit and based on our own, blood, sweat, and tears. That is not the case. As we talked about with white privilege, right, there are all sorts of ways in which society advantages white people and disadvantages people of color. So that is the way, in my experience running these trainings, people of color identify that institutional level racism, that privileging one group and marginalizing another based on race, whereas white people identify those individual acts of meanness, right, name calling and escalating up to hate crimes. And it's a really salient difference in the way that people see racism. One of the things that we hope you leave this training with, and this is a tough idea for some folks to embrace, is that because of the way that white people are, I would say, intentionally made blind to racism, to systemic and institutional racism. Because of that, we really have to choose to see its function. And because we spend, when compared against a person of color, we spend so many years of our life and so many critical years of development totally unaware of the way racism functions in society, we tend to say that people of color are experts in racism. They have PhDs in the way racism functions in this country, when white people are in like kindergarten on it. So typically, if we have one of these areas where a definition or an experience coming from people of color broadly describes an act or a policy or an issue of racism one way, they are much, much more likely to see it clearly than their white peers. Again, because those white peers have been trained for so long not to see it. So when we talk about institutional racism, we're talking about large institutions. We're talking about banking, access to wealth. We're talking about the criminal justice system. We're talking about employment. We're talking about access to education. And I just want to give you a few statistics that lean into that and give you an idea for what we're talking about. And these are, by no means a comprehensive list. They're just a small taste of the systemic ways in which white people are advantaged and people of color are disadvantaged in our society. So, excuse me, when it comes to access to wealth, people of color are 2.5 times more likely to be rejected for a loan with identical income. So that's coming into the bank with the same job, the same income, the same amount of money in the bank. People of color are 2.5 times more likely to be rejected for a loan. When it comes to criminal justice, black men receive prison sentences that are 20% greater than their white peers for the same crime. With employment, black men with clean records get callbacks for job interviews at similar rates to white men with felony records. Black-sounding names, and this is a study I believe out of Cornell, if you have a black-sounding name, they sent out fictitious resumes with names like Laquan and names like John on them. Black-sounding names resulted in roughly 1/3 less interview opportunities when given with an identical resume, right? So Laquan had 1/3 as high of a chance of getting an interview callback as John Smith did with an identical resume. When it comes to access to education, schools serving people of color are underfunded at a rate double that of their white peers, right? So schools that primarily serve a community of color are underfunded drastically more often and at drastically greater deficit than schools serving their white peers. For every 10% of the student base consisting of people of color, school funding drops nearly $100 per student, right? So we see all of these ways in which our society disadvantages people of color in terms of access to wealth, in terms of fair treatment under the law, access to employment, and access to education. And these have huge overarching impacts, right? And the cumulative effect of these three levels of racism that we've discussed thus far, the individual, the social, and the institutional racism, those all add up to what we refer to as systemic racism, right? This overwhelming structure that we have in this society to advantage white persons and disadvantage people of color. And I know I've talked for a long time here. We're doing our best to mix up what voice you're hearing, but I just want to talk about one more point with regards to this institutional racism. For many, many centuries in this country, I want to challenge anyone out there who's thinking that maybe this has to do with class or maybe this isn't a racial issue, right? For many, many centuries in this country, this experience of lack of access to wealth, health, education, employment was justified and also supported by an argument that people of color were actually biologically inferior. Well, that's been disproven, right? There's absolutely no biological basis for race to begin with, and we'll talk about that more later. But it's been utterly disproven. But an alternative theory, right, you have to have an alternative theory. And in this case, what's risen to the top, there's only one of two ways of viewing this. It's either that black people experience adult onset asthma at a rate 6 times greater than white people because of a biological inferiority. We don't believe that. Or they experience it because of a system that is designed to impose that on them, because of a system that ensures worse outcome for people of color. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about systemic racism. We're talking about that all-pervasive societal system that ensures worse outcomes for people of color than their white peers.
One more piece in the kind of levels of racism that kind of takes from the full systemic, looking at the entire picture, and kind of, you know, completes the loop back to the individual. Really comes through the you know, the stories and schema through which individuals make sense of the world, you know, and the scripts and presentations of media, of family members. These different pieces kind of help to reinforce the whole picture. You know, this shows up in what's referred to as internalized racism, which is loosely defined as internalization of racist attitudes towards members of their own ethnic group or race, including themselves. So we have this kind of compound piece that goes that takes this systemic effect of racism and kind of and doubles it in the own in you know, in the minds and experience of folks as they kind of, you know, these stories and schema that we learn throughout this whole society have an impact on how we see things going forward. For many years, and maybe every training for many years, at a certain point in the training, somebody would bring up this idea of reverse racism, and you know, the basic you know, the basic point would be, hey, like I'm a white person, and I have been you know, here would be an example, and I went to school in a mostly black neighborhood, and so I was the minority, and I suffered from the effects of racism because, you know, because I was white. And from the definition of racism, where race equals racial prejudice, this would be, you know, this could be true. When we look at racism with the definition that we're focusing on here, with the need for there to be a power piece, it really deconstructs kind of, you know, what racism is. Yes, there's a individual, perhaps a social racial prejudice going on, but there's not the vast institutional structures of racism behind it in education and finance and banking and criminal justice that make it an oppressive societal force. And so we used to spend some time on this, and we came across the work of a of an Australian comedian, Amr Rahman, who just nails it in such a way that we just play his video. So we're going to hop over to the YouTube for a little moment.
A lot of white people don't like my comedy. A lot of white people say this to me. Hey, Amr. Hey, you get on stage, you make your jokes about white people, say white people this, white people that. What if I did something like that, huh? What if I got on stage and I said, yeah, black people are like this, Muslims are like that. You'd probably call me a racist, wouldn't you? And I say, yeah, I would. Yeah, you should never do that. That's bad for your health. They're like, well, you do that, Amir. You do that. You get on stage, make your jokes about white people. Don't you think that's a kind of racism? Don't you think that's dun dun dun? Reverse racism. So no, I don't think that's reverse racism. Not because I think reverse racism doesn't exist, right? If you ask some black and brown people, they'll tell you flat out there is no such thing as reverse racism. I don't agree with that. I think there is such a thing as reverse racism, and I could be a reverse racist if I wanted to. All I would need would be a time machine, right? And what I do is I get in my time machine, I go back in time, before Europe colonized the world, right? And I convinced the leaders of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Central and South America to invade and colonize Europe, right? Just occupy them, steal their land and resources, set up some kind of, like, I don't know, trans-Asian slave trade where we exported white people to work on giant rice plantations in China, just ruin Europe over the course of a couple of centuries, so all their descendants would want to migrate out and live in the places where black and brown people come from. Of course, in that time, I'd make sure I set up systems that privileged black and brown people at every conceivable social, political, and economic opportunity. White people would never have any hope of real self-determination. Just every couple of decades, make up some fake war as an excuse to go and bomb them back to the Stone Age and say it's for their own good because their culture is inferior, and just kicks. Subject white people to colored people's standards of beauty, and they end up hating the color of their own skin, eyes, and hair. If, after hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of that, I got on stage at a comedy show and said, hey, what's the deal with white people? Why can't they dance? That would be reverse racism.
So I hope that video speaks into what we're talking about with regards to that systemic level, that massive level that we're talking about when it comes to racism, and dispels the idea of reverse racism as a thing that exists or has any power. The next section of this workshop, we're going to be talking about this concept of intent versus impact, and this is a really profound way of understanding not only issues of race, and specifically we're going to be talking about incidents when something comes up. This is a really useful tool for navigating discussions and interactions around racism, but it's also an incredibly useful tool around navigating any sort of social interaction, whether it be an issue around racism, a marriage, or an argument of any sort. Just incredibly useful. This distinction between intent and impact, and how we view interactions with other people. So when we talk about this, when it comes to intent, and we had on the last slide, I'm the master of my intent. You're the master of my impact. So intent, we understand ourselves by our intentions and motives. The idea here being that we judge our own actions based on what we meant to do, whether we were trying to do something good, trying to be helpful, so on and so forth. And we sometimes excuse our behavior if there's contention, knowing that, quote, we didn't mean it like that. When we talk about impact, we understand others, everyone else in the world, we judge them based on their behavior and how it impacts us, right? On its actual tangible results, on how it makes us feel, on the effect that it has on the world surrounding them.
So to go through impact and intent, we like to look at what is an incredibly typical kind of script around how this plays out on the ground when something is being called out as racist. And so I'm just gonna read through it, and then on the flip side we'll do a little reflection. When an accusation of racism is levied at an individual or a group of individuals, it is usually taken as a charge of deliberate foul play and is most often met with defensiveness.
Being considered fair-minded is extremely important to most, and especially those who identify with being progressive or liberal, which makes it extremely difficult for them to not personalize such criticism. One assumes that one's motives are under attack, instead of exploring the merit of the observation of inequity, likely providing a character resume in defense. At this moment, there's a counter-accusation of character assassination, followed by a lengthy explanation of one's true motives.
However, when an action is suspected of being racist, for example, what is under scrutiny is the net effect of the action and not its motive.
However, intent and impact are not the same thing. Good intentions do not mitigate negative effects. In defense of the intent, the impact is rarely investigated, leaving the one bringing forth the observation feeling frustrated.
The one making the original accusation may not have been taking the net effect of the action in question personally. However, the sense of not being heard, silenced, or invalidated is taken personally. This only serves to escalate the situation.
So this is an incredibly typical scenario. It's one that we've seen play out time and time again, and likely every person on the line right now has as well. This idea that an act is accused of being racist. The person receiving that accusation thinks that their intention is being attacked, right? That the person is saying that they have the person bringing up the concern is saying that they have ill intentions, they have bad feelings towards people of other races, and rather than investigating the merit of that action, the merit of the accusation around that action. Instead, they provide a character resume, they get defensive, they talk about how I didn't mean it like that, this is what I meant to do, so on and so forth. Now, rather than investigating the impact, right, which is what's really being talked about, what's really being talked about is the net effect of that action, right? It's whether that action made someone feel as though they were being treated badly. It's whether that action, in the case of policy, right, the legislature and the executive branch have enacted all these colorblind policies, right, that have supposedly no intention of disenfranchising people of color, but they have that impact, right? And what we want to do is we always want to be investigating the impact side. We want to see if the action in question actually has the effect of creating a safe space for people of color, creating opportunities to wealth, creating opportunities to health and education, right? We want to look at that impact side because at the end of the day, that's the side that is truly going to matter to the people experiencing it, right? Is the impact, is whether or not the action itself is helpful, right? Rather than whether it was meant to be helpful or meant to be hurtful, that's not in question. We can assume that everyone on the line here has the best of intentions with regards to social justice, the best of intentions with regards to environmentalism. We want to be always assessing the impact, just like we do in grant reporting, right? We're looking at the impact of our work. Similarly so, in dealing with issues of race and power, we always want to be looking at the impact of the action, the impact of the policy, and making sure that it supports racial justice.
Whenever we have a disagreement where basically we meant something and it's received a different way, talking about anything from a disagreement in a relationship to what we're covering today, it is kind of it's a pretty normal response to feel defensive. So this comes up, this defensiveness piece that is really kind of hinges this whole discussion. I mean, there was in this script there was someone called something out as racist, and immediately there was a defensiveness or shield that kind of brought kind of basically split ranks between impact and intent, and kind of missed the point entirely. Kind of getting in, knowing that defensiveness piece is there and comes up, and being willing to, and through practice, able to dislodge that part, that knee jerk to get back into what I intended, what I meant, and be willing to hear and to begin to see more clearly someone else's experience. That is the bridge point in this work. That is the place where trust is built, where difference of perspective is heard and realized. And I know as I was listening to Leo talk about and because about how this process, we have to look at the impact and determine how it interacts with, is this creating a more equitable society? You're like, whoa, that feels big. Like we're just, two folks working in a garden or planting a tree, in a community garden. Like, how does that giant piece show up there? And I think the point here is that that be it micro or macro, that willingness and ability to let go of your own viewpoint and your own thoughts about what you meant, and hear somebody else's perspective, to understand that that a person and perhaps a whole group of people have a different experience of something, is it is the critical turning point to being able to build diversity and build really trustful conversations and relationships across race.
So we want to address some of the common stumbling blocks. I know we went over this a little in the table of contents, but in doing these trainings over the last 10 years, excuse me, we've noticed that there are a number of places where, particularly for white folks, there is, obstacles to learning. There's moments of intellectual discord where they can't quite get over the hurdle. So we've compiled this list of 9 places that are common stumbling blocks regarding race and racism for white folks. And yeah, we hope that they are helpful. You may not be experiencing all of them, but you may be experiencing some of them, or folks in your organization may be. And these are sort of great intellectual and emotional hurdles to get over. So the first of them, and I'm going to do a little more reading from slides here, the first of them, white privilege and racism are social structures. Their existence did not make you or any individual white person good or bad. The moral imperative is in how you address them. So what we're getting at here is that there's a tremendous commonality for white folks to feel a profound sense of guilt when they start really digging into issues of white privilege and racism. That sense of guilt is, almost, it's incredibly predictable. It comes up for almost everyone. And, the idea here that white privilege and racism are social structures. You are, one something in the millionths responsible for their existence. But they do exist. They're very much real and they're very much active. But they are also very much huge. So these are social structures that exist, almost independent of, not quite independent, but barely related to you or I, right? In terms of how we prop them up. Their sheer existence doesn't create a value judgment for you. It's not, their sheer existence does not make you good or bad. There's nothing to feel guilty about in their existence. Now, where that guilt is reasonable is the moral imperative is in how you address them. So once we're aware of white privilege and racism, there is a responsibility, particularly on the part of white folks who have benefited from white privilege, who have benefited from racism as a social structure, to start actively working against them. It is, where power resides in society, in this country and throughout most of the world, white males have controlled, huge, vastly disproportionate portions of the power. So given that white folks have benefited from these structures and are the people with the power to change the structures, the moral imperative is on white people to start working against them. So that guilt, the only place where that guilt is reasonable is in propelling you forward to work against racism, to deconstruct these social structures, and it's only valid, that guilt, if you are not actively working against them.
Another piece on white guilt, which is itself a term that comes up a lot in this work, and it's basically the individual or collective guilt, emotion felt by some white people for the harm resulting from racist power structures historically and currently. I think there's two kind of important ways to look at this, and I think that it comes up is normal, in normal and textbook, and almost every time happens, and happens at different stages of learning around racism. I think one important piece is, guilt is it's a very emotive, both mental and emotive experience, and it's my belief, I'm no psychologist, but it's my belief that in looking at the vastness of racism's history, legacy, and current operation by white folks who, by definition of privilege, don't have to think about racism except at this moment in this training where they're choosing to put on that lens for society, right? That when actually looking at its largeness square in the society, it's heavy. It's heavy and emotional and distressing and disgusting, and it is a lot to feel, a lot to think of, and so I think sometimes guilt is just where all of that big feeling just gets shoved with without other places to put it. And so a lot of the work that one of our trainers does with folks when this real heaviness of guilt comes up is how to take that deep feeling, to feel it. I mean, in every training, there's tears, there's wow, I've never allowed myself to feel this inequity so deeply, and turn that into a passion, a dedication, a devotion for doing anti-racism and equity work. And I think that's one of the opportunities of guilt, in the sense that there's going to be big feeling. It probably will land in guilt, and keeping that feeling big, the idea isn't that the bigness of it goes away, it's that there's a different avenue for it.
So opting out of the mainstream or doing social benefit work does not exempt anyone from the effects of white privilege and racism. We've seen this a lot in our volunteer base and a lot in our peer groups. This idea that you can somehow lay down your privilege. Speaking from personal experience, when I was a younger man, I wore long hair and a beard, and I dressed in these alternative manners, right? And they resulted in me being treated poorly by the majority of American society, right? And so, as a result, there was this sort of idea that, like, oh no, I've laid down that privilege, right? I no longer benefit from it. Subsequently, I've cut my hair, gotten some much nicer clothes, and have sort of opted back in, if you will, right? And the idea here being that you can't actually opt out, because the social safety net that comes along with white privilege is always there, right? It is always there backing you up. In fact, it's what enables so many white people to make sort of alternative life choice decisions. And I had alternative life choice up in air quotes that you couldn't see. The second part here is that doing social benefit work does not exempt us from the effects of white privilege and racism either. It is simply not enough to say, oh well, I'm doing this thing that is good for the world, so it's an even swap, like a carbon credit or something. If you want to build those meaningful partnerships across racial boundaries, that is not going to be nearly enough. You have to be aware of how privilege functions. You have to be aware of how systemic racism functions. And you have to be doing stuff about it.
3, while often intertwined, race and class are not interchangeable. They are separate and different forms of oppression, yet they can multiply each other. So often, in trainings, we'll have folks, white folks that grew up in a low-income communities or settings, and when looking at a number of the institutional forces, there's a lot of resonance of some of the challenges that show up in a society that is where it is not easy to be of a lower class, where there are forces that make it very difficult to pull oneself out, and that is all true. And one of our main points here is that racism is operating all the while, both independently and most often entirely compounding those challenges throughout society. And even those that share some of the forms of oppression that come through class, there's another stack of experiences for folks who folks of color under the racist kind of operation in society, and to put on those, we often say, put on those goggles or put on those lenses that for a white person, again, that operation of racism, there needs to be a conscious choice to see the world that way and understand that that is also happening, and be able to from that place relate across experiences.
And I want to speak to one more thing in this point, which is that there's a real tendency throughout American society, I think particularly in the last decade or two, to look at issues of racism and say, aren't these just class issues, right? Isn't access to education a class issue? Isn't access to loans a class issue? And, you know, as we discussed in some of the statistics in the systemic racism section, that's simply not the case, right? There are specific ways in which racism is used systemically as an oppressive tool. So we talked about, you know, the access to bank loans, where with identical incomes and identical savings, people of color are 2.5 times more likely to be rejected for a loan. With identical resumes, black-sounding names get 1/3 less the callbacks for job interviews, right? So this attempt writ large by society to sort of sweep race under the rug as an issue of class is extraordinarily problematic. And as white folks working in communities of color, you cannot do it. If you attempt to sweep race issues under the umbrella of class, it will inevitably result in feelings of distrust, right? In the idea that you really don't understand what is going on in the world, and therefore you're not a partner who can be trusted. The simple statistical truth is that race and class are separate oppressive forms, and they can multiply each other. We have that because, you know, if you grew up poor and white, you did have, you know, the oppressive factors of classism affecting you. You did not have the oppressive side of racism. For people of color who grow up poor, which is by and large the case in this country, they have both of those factors multiplying each other and creating even more difficult situations.
Stumbling block number 4, a humanist or oneness approach. This does not trump difference of experience. We're going to go through a little a little script. This is some words from one of our trainers, Reverend Deborah Johnson out of Santa Cruz, who's done quite a lot of work in in unpacking some of the stuff and creating trainings. Humanism is the first step towards understanding and appreciating human potential. However, it is the first step in need of further refinement. While humanism affirms the central core of our humanity, its ambivalence towards differences make it unresponsive to particular needs of specific populations. Managing diversity requires a balance between the generic and the unique.
Likened to gardening, the person with the green thumb, who loves plants in general, is the most responsive to the specific needs of particular plants. The assumption that all plants can thrive in the same environment under the exact same conditions results in stunted growth for some.
Furthermore, a strictly humanistic approach runs the risk of ethnocentrism, a projection of one's own values onto others. The people are just like me mindset translates to everyone is just like me. Or people are just people translates to everyone is just like me. The pride that one takes in not noticing differences is easily misinterpreted by others as a protective emotional shield, unconscious use of privilege, or the unwillingness to learn.
And I would argue that it is not misinterpreted, that it is interpreted by others as a protective emotional shield, unconscious use of privilege, and an unwillingness to learn. So the idea here that we're talking about is that this universal approach where all people, aren't we just one people, so on and so forth, runs a strong risk of not identifying the specific needs of different groups of people, of different communities, in this case, communities of color. So one of the ideas here is that when we apply a sort of, and this gets into the next point here, a desire to move past this or to approach the world from a colorblind perspective. Well, when we overlay a colorblind or a universalist humanist approach onto a society that is has deep inequities within it, the result is more inequity, right? A colorblind perspective, you can never take a non-specific approach to a specific problem and expect good results. So in this case, we have systemic racism as a huge issue, and a colorblind approach to that is never going to dismantle that structure. Right? A colorblind approach to it, especially in situations where access to capital is so well rewarded and we have disparities in wealth, where access to education is so huge, such a huge disparity, and is such a useful tool in raising oneself up, a colorblind perspective is never going to dismantle those structures. Furthermore, the desire to move past this, that's real. Like, I'm with everyone on that. I want society to get past this. But unfortunately, the cold hard truth is that there is no way past except through in this case. Systemic racism has to be dealt with specifically in order for us to create that equitable society, in order for us to move past this.
Some of the feedback that we've gotten in connection with some of our partner organizations on the ground, especially the one organization that Leo was referencing earlier in Los Angeles, where we were I would say Common Vision had a pretty that our policy was that we were a colorblind organization. That we definitely didn't had that attitude of I just see people. I don't see race. We're all one human family. That's definitely was the overwhelming kind of outlook of our kind of staff and volunteers in the early days. And as we kind of came back, in this one case, like with prescriptive, hey, you all really need to do work around this if you're going to continue to partner with us and others. And after coming back a few years and having a few some more understanding and under our belts, we had a lot of more candid kind of discussion about experience on the ground that seems to be common for organizations and communities of color. That when white folks come in with this attitude, that it is not this attitude being this kind of colorblind approach, that it is not subtle. Like, it's not like, oh, I can't tell where they stand on this. That for someone who is a PhD in racism, it is immediately, like, palpably evident. And that's not something that we really understood initially, and has, that this isn't like subtle differences in how we respond to things. This is like a really easy read. And that this operation of, hey, like, I don't see race, I just see people, that translates into, I can tell that this person hasn't done clear thinking around race, which translates into this person is a time bomb to unlock racial patterns, racist patterns that they don't even know they have, which translates into there's only so much I can trust this person. And so on the ground, it's not a subtle piece, and it doesn't have to be as large as this in toppling all of systemic racism. That just in this interactive place, it's actually something that is quite evident and can make or break capacity for trust and partnership.
So number 7, never expect a clean and neat way to get beyond this issue. This is a messy conversation. Addressing systemic racism is difficult work, and it is messy work. The end goal here certainly is an equitable society. We are a long way from it, and there's a lot of hard work to be done between here and there. And there are going to be moments of discomfort. There are going to be moments of insecurity, moments where all hell breaks loose. But the work is important enough that it is worth trudging through, that it is worth doing the work to understand these huge factors at play and actively work against them. We can never expect just a clean and neat way to get beyond it. Certainly not, in the coming days, weeks, months, and years. It's going to require huge amounts of work from everyone involved.
2014 and 15 had more conversations, at least via Facebook, about race, and a much more nuanced conversation about racism in America, with the strong educational work of the Black Lives Matters movement in response to to all the heinous stuff that's been going on. And what is kind of very common in in reaction is I see a lot of comment threads where people say, "Oh, like I'm so tired of hearing about racism that and all Black Lives Matter this, like haven't we talked about this enough?" And I think I want to come back to the point that due to privilege, for white folks, it's a choice to see racism and its operation. And as tiring as it may seem to put on those lenses for a few hours here and there, or periodically throughout a year period, it's way more challenging, hard to experience racism on a day-to-day basis, I would imagine. And that kind of impetus for keeping the discussion alive, for even just to see the world that way, for white folks is important and necessary. So that quick switch back to can't we get beyond this, it has a sweeping under the rug effect that that isn't going to fly and isn't going to create a strong partnership.
And speaking to this getting beyond a resentment of political correctness, there was a huge blowback around political correctness that is really resurfacing again right now. I can't believe how much cheering there has been around we're not going to be politically correct. This is another thing, much like we talked about conflating issues of race and class. A resentment of political correctness has been used to sweep really salient issues under the rug. Trivializing issues of systemic racism really as language choices, as opposed to a structure that results in Black Americans having 3% of the wealth despite being 13% of the population. People say, we can't political correctness. We don't want to be politically correct. And what that does is it has a chilling effect on conversation. It has a chilling effect on interracial interaction, and it sweeps huge issues under the rug. It allows our society to essentially skate on the fact that it treats people extraordinarily differently on a systemic level depending on the color of their skin. So we really have to get beyond that resentment If you're feeling a resentment of political correctness throughout this training, there's really some work to do on that. I mean, these are huge issues that damage people's lives in extraordinary ways, and trivializing that as, I don't want to be careful with my language, is beyond offensive. It's ridiculous.
The goal is so much better and bigger than not offending people of color. I can't even name how many times that we've even gotten this far in a training, and then and there's this sense of, okay, so what can I say and can't I say so that people of color won't be offended in in different ways. And this sense that or this idea that it is folks of color who are just sensitive to this race stuff, and that the goal is to not offend them, is problematic in so many ways. It puts this entire discussion back in the court of, this is a black issue or a brown issue. This is people who are just naturally sensitive or get angry. They get angry and fired up about this stuff, and so our whole purpose is to just not piss anyone off. If you land there, I mean, we always say not offending people of color is a great goal if that's what you're doing currently. Like, let's be clear, like that's an improvement. But we're not going to get far at all if that's where the goal lies. The goal here is understanding the source and current operations of creation of inequity based on race in our society. The goal is creating meaningful understanding and conversation across differences in experiences based on race. The goal is dismantling this system of racism that is causing so many to be dampened in their capacity to reach full potential. These are the goals of anti-racism work, and when you hold the goals in the context of history, and take the hundreds and hundreds of years of stealing land and resources and enslaving people and keeping people down based on vast institutional structures, education, banking system, criminal justice, and all you're being asked to do is just switch up your language or not use some accent of some other culture in your joke. Like, it's not much to ask. It's like very, very little. It's like a baby step in a giant marathon we have to run together. And when we get stuck on this not offending people piece, we're kind of demonizing or adding to this schema of the angry person of color who's overly focused on race, and we're missing the point entirely.
All right, so if you're feeling tense, take a breath. Take a deep breath. We're through the definitional part of this training, and we're on to what we're going to do about it within our own organizations and within our own communities. So we're at that point in the training where we take everything that we've been talking about so far, and we look at how we're going to utilize this information going forward so that our own organizations are anti-racist at their very essence and can build those meaningful partnerships that we've referenced so much throughout this, and build spaces where our own organizations are not what's referred to as white space, space that is not safe for people of color. So the first step in this and these are just some beginning steps. There's so much more work to be done, but we wanted to leave you all with some very practical steps that we can take within our own organization. And the first is to create organizational standards and statements around where you stand on issues of race. So these are some organizational standards that we've crafted over the years that are, they're present on our website, they're present in our volunteer outreach, they're sort of through and through have a strong presence in our outward-facing marketing and communications documents, I guess, but are also, very strongly the standards that we hold our staff and volunteers to. So the first of them, it's Common Vision's policy that staff and volunteers, individually and collectively, demonstrate maximum respect in attitudes and actions to all people of the many culturally diverse and racially diverse communities visited during programs.
Common Vision is committed to cultivating a living and working environment that intentionally seeks to promote the coexistence of people of diverse backgrounds and identity based on mutual respect and integrity. Common Vision requires that the staff and volunteer living and working environments are free from discrimination on the basis of race, class, ethnicity, religion, gender, or sexual orientation.
So these are some basic statements that cover two different areas of our work. The first of them is in our outward-facing interactions, right? So this is in the communities that we work with. We expect that our crew demonstrate maximum respect and attitude towards everyone we interact with. When it comes to issues of race and racism, part of that is understanding these systemic factors at play, right? That is a respectful action, is to be aware of those and operate in a way that helps to dismantle them and not a way that helps to prop them up. The second of these statements is about our internal interactions, right? It's about creating a working and, in our unique case, because of the way we run volunteers, living environment that is intentionally supportive. And for us, what this has meant is that, for example, humor is an area where this comes up a lot, where someone uses an accent, right? An accent of a people from somewhere else in the world, or from here in the world, uses an Ebonics accent or a Chicano Latino accent in order to make a joke, right? And the net result of this is that it hurts people of color. The impact side is that it hurts people of color. And the benefit is just this, there is none. I mean, the benefit is a little laugh for, white people in the room, essentially. And it's not an action that is conducive to creating an environment, a safe workplace, a workplace where, people of many diverse backgrounds can thrive. So we have these two statements within our organization, and if your organization doesn't have similar statements on where you stand on race and racism, so on and so forth, these are just a starting step so that everyone who comes into your organization has already signed on to a sort of code of conduct surrounding these issues.
Second piece of take-home things you can do with your organization to move in this direction. Know your history. You just can't do this work of social justice, cross-cultural connection, or as it was develop what Relief is referring to as cultural competency around issues of race, unless you know the history, how things got to be how they are in the places where you're working. So understand the history of systemic racism, both in the big sense and then how it relates and affects your stakeholders directly. And continue your examination of where you work and see how it intersects with this legacy of racism in America. Something that Common Vision has started to do with our volunteer trainings and for all of our educators. Before we go into an area, we take some time to look at some of the history. For example, we do this exercise every year when we're down in Los Angeles. And when people hear like Compton, South Central, these are places that the media and some of the rap music of the early 90s popped up on put deep in the limelight, created all sorts of different ideas about that affect how folks get ready for and feel when they're going into a place like South Central. And so something that we focus on is like what is the history here, and how can you show up respectfully. and so for every area, we have a social justice history. You know, just like some bullet points on for South Central as an example. Always useful to start all the way back to the first peoples, looking at the Tongva and the Chumash. Up until the mid-1700s, there was thousands of years of living on that land by the native peoples. You know, fast forward, kind of post-slavery, end of Reconstruction, all the way through the 1940s, we have some different waves uh, of people, of population increase in Los Angeles. A whole bunch of a big population of black migration in the 40s, looking for jobs and opportunity and fleeing the south and east where there was an opportunity. You run into all sorts of pieces that you really just need to know to understand how South Central came to be how it is today. In that time, in the 40s and 50s, there were only 2 areas of the city representing about 5% of the total area. This is like the Watts and South Central area where blacks and Latinos were allowed to rent and own land. This continued all the way to the end of the 60s. Kind of on top of that, white gangs in the 50s and early 60s, these Ku Klux Klan influenced forces kind of further emphasizing that folks of color weren't to cross these lines that were actually, you know, legal lines in the terms of housing, but imaginary lines for everything else. And so you start to see this really dense population of black and brown folks in the area of South Central and Watts. You know, fast forward through the Watts riots, the flight of white folks out of those areas in that time, and you begin to see some really compounded. You know, brings us through 1970, and then, you know, from there, looking at the conditions, the education opportunities, the work opportunities. That was only, you know, 45 some odd years ago. And that is important to understand when, as far as the history of that place.
If you're unfamiliar with the term redlining, it is one that is well worth reading up on. That has had profound results on the way housing and wealth is distributed across our society, and has great impacts in a lot of the DACs that you'll likely be working in. Furthermore, that housing density, I want to tie it to urban forestry for a moment, because that housing density that Michael's referring to is a direct contributor to the distinctions in canopy coverage between communities of color and their white peers. A lot of times this is one of those issues that people try to sweep under as a class issue. It is not. Because of housing covenants, because of redlining, you ended up with immense population densities in communities of color and very, very little green space. So when we think about, you know, just the benefits of the urban forest and how those are distributed inequitably racially, it is the result of specifically racialized programs like redlining and housing covenants that resulted in that population density and that lack of green space. So specifically, when we look at these environmental justice issues are racial justice issues. They have their roots in racial justice issues. So we have to understand that in order to do effective work going forward. So within our organizations, we want to build ally culture. And when we talk about ally culture, we're talking, you know, this concept of being an ally. This is the idea of, you know, a white person who is an ally in the fight for racial justice, right? They are in solidarity with communities of color. One of my favorite things that I heard in all the equity and inclusion conversation at the Riverside workshop, and this was mentioned very briefly, you may not even have caught it, but was that, you know, oh, when you're getting volunteers, you may have a hard time recruiting people. People might not seem that engaged, but once you join them in their other political and social struggles, people will be very, very engaged in your work. And it was said very quickly, almost, you know, I looked around the room and it didn't seem like a lot of people really heard what was said there. But that's that idea of being an ally, is joining the communities that you're working with in their other political and social struggles, right? And in the struggle for racial justice particularly. So we want to build a culture within our organizations that specifically does that to make ourselves good potential partners in communities of color. And these are some things that we can do in our own organizations that can result in building that culture. This is a great first step: training for leadership staff and volunteers. As we've alluded to throughout this training, we have every volunteer who works in our organization, all of our staff and our leadership, anti-racism trainings. So we're consistently going deeper on this issue. We're consistently making sure that everybody within our organization, from our communications director to our bookkeeper to our executive directorship, is consistently working on their own growing edges around race and racism, and getting deeper understandings of how those systems function, how we've internalized them, and how we can deconstruct them in our partnerships. So those ongoing trainings are just incredibly important in building an anti-racist culture.
Number 2, do not rely on people of color within your organization to create a culture of diversity. We leave each of our trainings with very few rules, and the rest are kind of guidelines. One of them is one of the rules we leave is don't end this training and then turn to the staff or volunteer member of color and start asking them questions about this. It is not the responsibility of folks of color to train up white folks in racism and anti-racism work. It's just not. Folks of color have experienced enough of racism to not have to have educating on racism kind of piled on their their giant experience of this thing. Let's be really clear as white folks that it's work that we have to do with ourselves, and we have to counteract the, and it happens even with the rules that we set regularly, where the folks of color who are on tour, on project with us, will just catch, just like, oh, can we just talk about this one thing, or how did that make you feel? And suddenly the conversation is kind of thrown back in the court of folks of color to hold this thing. Yeah, so that's just incredibly important to recognize that tendency and to counteract it for the sake of the folks of color within the organization.
And that in those cases where a person of color within your organization has taken it upon themselves to do a little bit of education work, to put themselves out there and call something out which is not their responsibility, or to educate your organization, what a treasure! Like, what an incredible thing to offer, and to really value that and take the time to learn from it when it's offered and not to go seek it is incredibly important. Our third point here is to break silence, to always interrupt racism. This is incredibly important, both within having the ability to have a diverse organization, and in terms of working with communities of color as you go forward in your work. One of the most common sort of responses to hearing something racist said or seeing a racist action or policy implemented is that folks are uncomfortable, but they don't say anything. And the onus and responsibility of white people to break that silence and to interrupt racism whenever it happens is absolutely critical to building an organization that is a workable space for people of color, right? Whether they be partnering organizations, staff, volunteers, or leadership. Having an organizational culture that does not let it go unnoticed, that does not let it go unspoken. So anytime we see anything happen, whether it's a microaggression, which is one of these little tiny ways in which racism expresses itself that are not so tiny when they stack up in their sort of implementation. We're talking about things like, oh, you have such weird hair, it's so different than mine, or what are some other quick examples? There's There's little things like talking about, whether saying that a community that I'm trying to work in, quote, has no community, right? These are ways in which sort of, that second one is an example of this inferior culture idea that is super pervasive. And interrupting that whenever we hear it is just absolutely critical. I cannot stress the importance enough of, as soon as you hear something like that, going, hey, so that supports, saying that there's no community in this place really supports this inferior culture trope that for a very, very long time has been used to, paint a picture of black and brown communities that is, destructive and doesn't build people up, right? So always interrupting the pieces of racism that we hear is absolutely critical. And to that
Hand in
end,
hand
Michael,
with
will you speak to continuing the conversation?
Yeah. The breaking silence, speaking about racism, it's a language. It's a language of interrupting. It's a language of choosing to understand the effects, micro and macro. And as we say, microaggressions, not so micro. That's something we like to say in our trainings. That your ability to find words and practice your words such that when something arises, you have the confidence and willingness to stop time for a moment, say, hey, that's not going to stand in this community, goes a long way, and it requires practice. It's, like I said, if you haven't been doing it for most of your life, like you probably haven't been, because that's the way society deals with racism, it's going to take practice to feel, I don't know if you'll ever feel comfortable, but to feel confident. I've been known in situations where I don't have the words to interrupt, and I'll just be like, oh no. We'll just be like, and then I'll figure out or not. It doesn't even matter. Like, it's like not about how good I sound coming off. It's about breaking the silence every time and creating that safe space so that those aggressions aren't just for folks of colors to experience, and if they so choose to speak out, put themselves out as potentially being labeled that angry black person or that Latino that's always talking about race. There's so much value as an ally in that, continuing that conversation and being and taking on that onus and practicing that language of interruption.
So as we move to questions, we want to leave you with this quote. And if you have questions, please, by all means, type them. We've got one to answer so far. But this is the next and more profound stage of the battle for civil rights. We seek not just freedom, but opportunity. Not just legal equity, but human ability. Not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and as a result. And that last piece, that not equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and as a result, is really what we're talking about building towards here today. The theory, at least legally, of equality has been in place since the Civil Rights Act, and in some circles well before that. But where we stand today, we have not achieved that equality as a fact and as a result piece. And that, to us, is the work at hand. That is the continuation of the civil rights movement, is ensuring that skin color, that race is not deterministic in any manner when it comes to people's access to wealth, access to health, access to well-being, access to education. The idea that we live in a society where race is still deterministic when it comes to almost every factor involved in leading quality of life is just unacceptable. And the work is for all of us in this room to create that equity amongst the urban forestry community, but I hope that the work goes beyond that and that we all see to it in that greater context to create that equity as a fact and as a result.
So we're right on the edge of time. We have two questions on the docket. One is, how do you interrupt if you don't know what to say? Here's where practice comes in, and this is actually something, the continuation of these trainings that you're doing within your organization is an awesome time to run scenarios. Here, this thing is said, pop quiz, hotshot, what do you say? It takes some time to get it on the tongue, And I always err on the side of interrupt first, figure out what I'm going to say later, because I'm not, I can't let that silence sit for another second. And I think that's the general attitude, and the language follows, and it follows in practice.
Absolutely, and practicing in those trainings in those low pressure situations is absolutely critical to developing your skills around interrupting racism. But also, I think what Michael was speaking to of not letting an unsureness of what you're saying prevent you from interrupting. The result of interrupting in and of itself, obviously it's better to do it if you do know exactly what to say, but just the act of interrupting is incredibly powerful as far as creating a cohesive space and a space that is, truly promoting diversity as opposed to using it as a meaningless term.
Yeah, something I'll default to often is it's the intention of this space that we that all people feel safe and invited into this conversation, and that language or attitude or accent is not really following suit, and or something to that effect. Like I said, interrupt first, get some language later, practice, practice, practice.
And I would just echo to that, one of the important things about interrupting immediately is that all the people present for the action are also present for the interruption. It is simply not enough to pull the volunteer or staff member aside later and discuss it with them and try to convince them that what they said shouldn't be said again. It has to be interrupted in the very moment.
There's a question about safe spaces question.
Yep. One of the questions we've got is, do safe spaces hinder or help the conversation about racism? And safe space, I think everyone is probably familiar with that, but it's a term that's come up a lot in recent years around creating spaces where no one feels attacked. And there's an interesting edge around it, where it is incredibly important to provide people with truly safe space, but also, as we've talked about a lot, discomfort is a sign that you're that you're growing. It's a sign that you're in an area where you need to tread. So while no one should feel attacked in this work, I really like one of the participants here answered with, I prefer to use the term brave space, which I've never heard before and I think is absolutely fantastic. Just to read the rest of her answer, I like to tell folks feeling uncomfortable is normal, but leaning into discomfort helps you grow. Usually being uncomfortable means you're on your learning edge. The other thing I would argue here is that safe space can also be used as a tool to sweep really salient issues under the rug. And I would argue that within our organization and within, hopefully your organization as well, if you have white folks who are claiming that they feel unsafe around conversations about race and power, I'm going to go ahead and say that 9 times out of 10, maybe 99 times out of 100, that shouldn't fly. The reality is that safe space is something that we should create for people who are oppressed around an issue, right? The people who are disadvantaged by an issue need safe space around that issue. So people of color need safe space.
Unmuted.
Right? Trans people need safe space around transphobia. Women need safe space around sexism, right? And what those spaces actually are spaces that are free of racism. They're spaces that are free of transphobia. They're spaces that are free of sexism. So unless we tackle these issues head on, we can't actually create that safe space. And just backing up for a moment, I think more than likely, if you have white folks within your organization who are calling for safe space around race, unless they are specifically being, I can't even fathom a situation where they're specifically being attacked or bullied around it. It's almost certainly being used as a proverbial fig leaf for a place where more conversation is really needed.
Wow, great thoughts. We're a little bit over here, but this conversation is just so wonderful. Everyone give a huge thank you to Leo and Michael for their huge input today. we are going to have this webinar recorded. It's been recorded. We'll put it up on our website and you'll get an email about it if you signed up or if you go californiarelief.org. Thank you all so much for being here today. If you have any questions, you can send them to us in the follow-up email or at info@californiarelief.org. Thank you again for being here, and thank you, Common Vision, for doing what you're doing and helping us make a better impact in our communities. Everyone have a wonderful day.